While the Orioles are certainly dealing with some injuries right now in camp, the one position group that's pretty healthy is the outfield. So let's take a look at that outfield heading into 2025 and preview the position group coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, March 12th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we continue our Orioles positional preview series. We've already talked about the catchers, DHs, and first baseman on an episode last week. This week, we move out to the outfield, maybe the healthiest position group in spring training for the O's at the moment. They had some big subtractions. Anthony Santander is out. They had some key additions. Tyler O'Neill and Ramon Laureano are in. What is this playing time? What is the outlook? What is the production going to be from this outfield group? We're going to talk about that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. But before we get there, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. While you're there, subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps out the pod. And of course, we're here on YouTube as well. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. And if you have any thoughts about the show, questions, mailbag questions, comments, want to talk ball, anything like that, you can always email me at lockedonorioles@gmail.com. But let's jump into it. Our second positional preview of the offseason. We're going to do 5 of them. And we are going to move into the outfield, a group that has a lot of talent, but is going to look a little different than it did in 2024. And as we split up these previews, we talk about the main starters, we talk about the bench and the depth, and then we talk about the prospects who are getting close to the big leagues at that position. So let's begin with who are the main starters in this Oriole outfield. Of course, Anthony Santander is no longer there, been part of the Orioles at the big league level since 2017, left and signed a 5-year deal in free agency with the Toronto Blue Jays this offseason. He is the biggest subtraction from this outfield. But we start with Colton Cowser, who should be stepping into even larger of a role in 2025 after coming off a great full rookie campaign when he finished second in AL Rookie of the Year voting. And quite honestly, he should have won that award last season. And Colton really should be in there pretty much every day. Coming off a 4-WAR season, he was about a 120 WRC plus hitter last year. That is 20% better than the league average. And we know he had his ups and downs, and the lows were pretty low. The highs were super high, but it evened out to be a really good rookie season. And again, I think he's going to play pretty much every day because he has the talent. He's one of the 5-6 best hitters on the Orioles. No question about that. And I think we know he's going to be in there against righties. He's going to play left field and maybe a little right field on the road, depending on what the tougher outfield corner is against right-handed pitchers. And then against lefties, I think the Orioles are going to move Cowser into center field most of the time against left-handers. Now, he's not amazing against lefties. He had an 89 WRC plus against left-handed pitching last year. It's, below average, but not unplayable. He's still young. He's going to continue to get better against lefties. Meanwhile, you have Cedric Mullins, who we'll talk about in a second. It should be the Orioles' main center fielder. Mullins against lefties last year had a 43 WRC plus. That is unplayable. And so that's why I think they're going to sit Mullins versus lefties, and Cowser, who showed last year that while he's a much better defensive left fielder, and another award he was snubbed of, he should have won the Gold Glove in left field in the American League last season. He showed to me last year, because I was a doubter, that he can play center field. He played 310 innings in center for the Orioles last year, and he had a +1 outs above average. He was seen as an above average defender in center and an elite defender in left, and he's good out there in right as well when he does get some innings. So that's where I see Cowser. Again, I see him in there almost every day. Now, he'll get some days off, and when he does get days off, it's most likely going to be when there is a left-hander on the mound. I don't think he's going to play 162. Not many guys do at all, but he'll play 150 to 155 games and be in there most of the time for the Orioles. Now, there are still certainly things to work on for Cowser. It was a good rookie season. There's a chance he could take a step back. He has a 30.7% strikeout rate last season. That was the third highest K rate among all qualified hitters in the big leagues last year. Only Zach Geloff of the A's and Ellie De La Cruz of the Reds was a qualified hitter who had higher than Cowser's 30.7% strikeout rate. That is an issue. Also, he was killed by changeups from right-handers. It was his kryptonite last year. Hit 185 against those pitches with a 43% swing and miss rate. That's something he's clearly got to work on this season as well, but he's going to get the everyday at-bats again, and I do think he deserves them. He's got a floor of like a power, defense, and speed guy who needs to cut down on the strikeouts, but he is going to be out there pretty much every single day for the Orioles. And when a right-hander is on the mound, you can expect Cedric Mullins to be out there pretty much every single day in center field for the O's. He is in the final year of his rookie contract before he hits free agency, and it was a pretty average offensive season for Mullins overall last year, but against righties, he was great. He had huge splits. It was a 121 WRC plus against righties. That's someone you want in there every single time. And as I mentioned already, a 43 WRC plus against lefties, someone you want nowhere near the batter's box when a left-handed pitcher is on the mound. And it's hard to say Cedric Mullins is a platoon player right now because, again, he's such an elite defensive center fielder. He can change the game on the base paths. He's meant so much for the Orioles really for 6+ years at this point. But if he is the hitter that he was last year, which isn't a bad thing, he ended the season above league average, still a good defender and center. That's still a useful major league player who you want on your roster. But I talked about this when I did the Cedric Mullins season review earlier this offseason. I don't know if I consider Mullins an everyday player anymore. Now, he's still a main starter because, again, he's going to play against righties, and you're going to see way more righties than lefties. Orioles played 162 games last season. They saw, I believe, 43 left-handed starters and 119 right-handed starters. So if you're playing 119 starts, you're a main starter. I would consider you on that team. And that's what I think Mullins will be because he's still productive with the bat against righties. But against lefties, among left-handed hitters who saw at least 100 plate appearances against left-handed pitchers last year in the big leagues, Mullins was the third worst hitter of that group. That is not a category that you want to be in. That is not production you want. Now, he's still going to play a great center field. He can still steal you 30 bases, and you still want him in there. But I truly would sit him full-time against left-handed starters. He can certainly pinch hit later in those games when a righty comes in. He can pinch run. He can come in and be a defensive replacement in center field. He can still impact the game later, even if he's sitting early against a left-handed starter. But the Orioles, a good thing they did when they added to this team this offseason is brought in more hitters who crush left-handed pitching. As we'll talk about in a moment, the Orioles have enough options to beat left-handers that they don't need to throw Mullins out there in those 40 to 45 games per year where they face a lefty. And he's projected to play about 130 games. I think he'll play in more because he'll start 110 to 120 and then he'll come off the bench in a bunch more. But what the Orioles did last season is the O's faced 43 left-handed starters. Cedric Mullins started 17 of those 43 games, so it was less than half. But early in the year, the Orioles treated Mullins as an everyday player. He started 11 of the Orioles' first 16 games against left-handed starters. That's mostly an everyday guy. And then down the stretch, against the final 27 left-handers the Orioles faced, Mullins started only 6 of those games. And he honestly only started 6 because the O's were so injured down the stretch of the year. There wasn't really a lot of other guys to throw into the lineup. Mullins was healthy. He was hitting a little bit. They were just like, go out there and hit ninth and try and do something for us against a lefty. With a healthy Orioles team with these right-handed bats, I don't see a reason to throw him out there against a left-handed starter. It's still the big side of a platoon in center field, but that is where I see Mullins' role being in what is most likely going to be his final season in Baltimore. Then that third main starter in the outfield, because Anthony Santander is gone, is the guy they brought in to somewhat replace him, and that is Tyler O'Neill, who signed a 3-year, just shy of $50 million contract with the Orioles this offseason. Now, it does include a player opt-out after year 1, so O'Neill, if he really plays well and stays healthy, could become a free agent again after the season. If not, he would opt in and be in Baltimore for 2 more years. Now, for O'Neill, production-wise, pound for pound, he was pretty equal last year with the Red Sox to what Santander did with the Orioles. The difference is O'Neill has had so many injury issues in his career that he just can't stay on the field. Tyler O'Neill played 113 games for the Red Sox last year. Second most games played of his career, and he's been in the big leagues for 7, almost 8 seasons now. That's a concern. He's had so many injury issues, but when he's healthy, he's been great. And he was brought in to bring the power production that was vacated by Anthony Santander. He's projected by Fangraphs for like a 120 to 130 WRC plus, but only in 110 games. Some of that is because I don't think everyone's convinced he's an everyday player. And some of that's because he's just had so many injuries. You have to project in that he's going to miss a couple of weeks at least at some point in the season. Now, we know he's going to be in there every single day against lefties. He'll either play the outfield or DH against left-handed pitching. O'Neill had a 215 WRC plus against lefties last year. There was only one hitter in Major League Baseball who was better against lefties last season, and his name was Aaron Judge. So I'm pretty sure O'Neill is going to be in there every day against lefties, and that's fine because, Mullins is going to sit against a lefty. O'Neill is going to be in there against a lefty. Now, against a righty, that's a different conversation because O'Neill was paid. We'll see if this becomes a multi-year deal. It depends on his opt-out situation. But if he stays after this year, he will end up being the first multi-year contract given out by Mike Elias as Orioles GM. That feels like a move you would make to a guy who's close to, if not is, an everyday player in your lineup. But we're still a little unsure because Tyler O'Neill was a below average hitter, 91 WRC plus against righties last year. It's not an automatic that he's going to be in there every time against righties. And you have Heston Kjerstad, who we'll get to in a moment, who's going to be in that mix. In his career, he's just slightly above average against righties and great against lefties. So really, his playing time against lefties, 40, 45 games, we know he'll be in there. The rest of the 162 kind of all depends on A, how much the Orioles want to rest him to just kind of avoid injury in general, and B, how much he gets injured. Like when he's in the field, he'll play some left field, he'll play some right field, he'll DH a little. He can play center field in a pinch if you need him to defensively as well, so he'll move around a little bit. But I think he'll play against all the lefties and then maybe like 2/3 of the righties. So if you're assuming you have 120 games against right-handed starters, maybe O'Neill's in the starting lineup for 80 of them. That puts him at about 120 starts. And then he's still a very useful pinch hitter when you're facing a lefty late in the game. Like if O'Neill sits to start a game against a righty, he's going to be ready because as soon as, insert left-handed reliever here for one of these other AL East teams or whoever it may be comes out of the bullpen, like it is Tyler O'Neill time to come in there and mash a home run against a lefty, which is what he does very, very often. Like Aroldis Chapman, I believe, is in Boston now. He comes out there. You're going to Tyler O'Neill off the bench if you have that opportunity. So he's going to get into more games as a pinch hitter late against lefties, but I don't know if I see him playing every single day. I think with Santander gone, O'Neill is going to take the bulk of that production. But I also think a guy like Heston Kjerstad is going to step in, be given a chance to step in, and fill in the rest. And he's the main guy we're going to talk about up next. I wouldn't consider Kjerstad one of the three main starters in the outfield, but his biggest role in the big league so far is going to come in 2025. Now, how big is that role? We'll try to figure that out coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, personally, I like the classic pistachio. You got to crack it open to get to that delicious nut inside. However, some people love the no shells variety, and Wonderful Pistachios has that too. And there's so many great flavors to choose from. It's just the perfect stack for being on the go. So get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. So for the Orioles outfield, we move from their main starters and into the bench and depth guys for this Orioles outfield. And we start with the 2 guys who I believe will be on the opening day roster. Not full bench players. They'll be contributing, but will be playing less than the 130, 120 games, at least starting less than those top 3 guys we talked about. The first one is Heston Kjerstad. I don't think he's going to be an everyday player for this Orioles team. There's just not the at-bats out there yet. Maybe in 2026 that is the case if he impresses this year. But Kjerstad certainly should see a larger role here in 2025 because, as I mentioned, I think Tyler O'Neill plays against every lefty and then maybe 2/3 of righties. In those other 1/3, those other 40 games when you face a right-handed starter, that's where Heston Kjerstad is going to really step in and be able to try and carve out a role for himself. Now, listen, he had a 116 WRC plus and a fairly small sample size last year, 114 plate appearances, had some injuries, specifically that concussion after taking a sinker at 97 off the head from Clay Holmes in July. And just the concussion lasted for a while, just never fully recovered from that. Basically lost most of the second half of his season just because of that concussion. And we know how much medical and injury stuff Kjerstad has gone through since the Orioles drafted him second overall in 2020. And, success that the Orioles have had from Colton Cowser and Ryan O'Hearn the last couple of years have pushed down some potential playing time for Kjerstad as well. But this seems to be the year where he's not going to be an everyday guy, but we can at least pencil him into the lineup. Because, yeah, they replaced Santander. They made another signing with Tyler O'Neill. But again, they didn't replace him with a guy who they expect to start 150 games. Even if they want Tyler O'Neill to start 150 games, we know the injury situation with him that's going to come up. He's not going to play that many games. They're not going to let him because they want to keep him healthy for when it matters most. That is when Kjerstad comes in. So maybe right now I'm projecting like 50 starts at most and some other games where he comes in as a pinch hitter later. But things are going to come up, injuries and others, where Kjerstad's probably going to end up starting more than those 50 games if he sticks on the roster throughout the season. And he does have options. So if things aren't going well, he's not perfectly fitting, he could be sent to AAA again. It's not out of the question. Orioles are going to have like a weird decision to make when Jorge Mateo comes back. And unfortunately, Kjerstad could be one of the guys they could send back. I wouldn't want them to do it, but it is possible. But I think he'll split time against righties with Tyler O'Neill. He'll play some left field, some right field, depending on what's easier in the ballpark. I think he's gotten a little bit better defensively out there. It's not amazing. He's never going to play center, but he's got sneaky speed. He just needs to get a little more fluent out there in the outfield. And he could play a little against lefties. It kind of depends on what the lineup is. If there's a time against a lefty when Gary Sanchez is not in the starting lineup, Adley Rutschman is catching, and DH is open, there's maybe a chance they could throw Heston Kjerstad in there. Like, he's looked okay against left-handed pitching so far in his professional career. But I do think he'll be on this roster all year. And as soon as somebody's banged up, there's an injury in the outfield, whatever it may be, like, he's already going to get some playing time. I think O'Neill will get a little more of it early in the season, but they're going to work Kjerstad in to keep O'Neill healthy and also get Kjerstad key at-bats. And at worst, he's going to be one of the better pinch hitters in baseball who's starting a couple of times a week and is an important part of this Orioles bench. But as soon as injury comes in, he can step in pretty much anywhere except for center field. He just has to avoid getting injured himself. And a lot of things that have happened to Kjerstad have not been his fault at all. But this is a key year for him to stay healthy and step in when he can, because then when Cedric Mullins is gone next year and potentially Tyler O'Neill even opts out, Ryan O'Hearn becomes a free agent, Heston Kjerstad could absolutely be an everyday player in 2026 for the O's if he shows in a more limited role this year that he can handle the bat at the big league level. And the other outfielder I see on the opening day roster is Ramon Laureano. I see him in more of a bench role than Heston Kjerstad will have. Orioles signed the veteran outfielder to a one-year, $4 million deal this offseason. And Laureano, who was quietly great with the Braves last year, he was with the Guardians to begin the year, was basically unplayable in his first 31 games. The Guardians released him. He wasn't hitting at all. He signs with the Braves because Acuna's hurt, and who else got hurt? I mean, Albies was hurt for a while. Riley was hurt. Michael Harris was hurt. Everybody was going down for Atlanta, so they signed Ramon Laureano. And he played in 67 games for the Braves, had 226 plate appearances, and slashed 296, 327, 505, good for a 129 WRC plus. He was fantastic in Atlanta, and he was at his best against lefties. He had a 139 WRC plus against lefties throughout the whole season. And with the Braves specifically, in 66 plate appearances against left-handed pitching, Laureano hit 377 with a 424 on base and a 639 slugging. That's a 193 WRC plus with Atlanta against lefties. So he's someone else the Orioles brought in who can play all three outfield positions, which is good. You can put him in center if you need to. He's an up and down outfielder range-wise, but he's got one of the strongest and most accurate outfield arms in all of baseball. That is his best tool. He has a little pop in that bat. He hits lefties. I feel like he fits this roster nice. He's kind of the replacement for the roles that Austin Hayes and Austin Slater, and going back a little further, Ryan McKenna have played for this Orioles team. Laureano might just be a better version of all those guys if he produces like he did in Atlanta. And he could be in there every time the Orioles face a lefty. It might not be every single game, but most lefties the O's face, Laureano is going to be in there. He certainly can be a pinch hitting option against lefties. He could be a defensive replacement option late in games for the O's. And I think he'll start against some righties from time to time, just like Kjerstad might start against some lefties from time to time, just to get some guys some breaks. You know, he's a veteran who used to be, especially with the Oakland Athletics, an everyday player who faced righties and can handle himself in the box there as well. And if the Orioles are really trying to get the most platoon advantages, which we know Brandon Hyde loves to do, and it's generally worked out for him in his time as Orioles manager, this is what an Orioles lineup against a left-handed starting pitcher could look like. You could see Westberg leading off at third, Adley Rutschman DHing, hitting second. I think a lot of the times, as we talked about on the last positional preview, that Gary Sanchez will catch is when a lefty's on the mound, but they still want Rutschman in there, so he will DH. So Rutschman DHing, hitting second. Henderson hitting third at shortstop, O'Neill in right field hitting fourth, Mountcastle at first base hitting fifth, and Cowser in center hitting sixth, Arias at second base hitting seventh, Gary Sanchez catching hitting eighth, and then Ramon Laureano in left field hitting ninth. Now that sits four lefties basically on the bench. You have Jackson Holliday down. That's something where I think eventually as the season goes on, Jackson will be more of an everyday player, but maybe early in the year you sit him against some lefties. Maybe some Arias plays against the other. That sits Ryan O'Hearn. You don't want him starting against lefties. That sits Cedric Mullins. You don't want him starting against lefties. And that sits Heston Kjerstad. You're probably okay with him starting against lefties, but you'd, with the production, maybe rather have a righty like Laureano in there. So I'm not saying against every lefty it's going to be like this, but that is a lineup of guys where there are only two left-handed hitters in there against a left-handed pitcher. One of them is MVP candidate Gunnar Henderson, and the other one is the guy who should have won Rookie of the Year in Colton Cowser. That is how scary this lineup is going to be against lefties, and that's not even including Jackson Holliday and Heston Kjerstad in your lineup. And then all of a sudden, you get a right-handed reliever in there. Think about the pinch hitters you would have to change a game late. Jackson Holliday, Ryan O'Hearn, Heston Kjerstad, and Cedric Mullins are your pinch hitters. They could all come in and pinch hit for Gary Sanchez, for Ramon Arias, for Ramon Laureano late in that game, even for Ryan Mountcastle, to get you those platoon advantages again. Brandon Hyde has a lot to work with if this group stays healthy, and it's going to be really, really interesting. But there is also depth behind these bench guys. I would say Dylan Carlson is that first line of depth for the Orioles. O's signed him to a one-year, $1 million deal this offseason, switch hitting, 26-year-old outfielder who can play all three outfield positions. Been with the Cardinals for most of his career, spent the last couple months of the season with the Rays last year before becoming a free agent. And for Carlson, he has minor league options. He's probably going to begin the year in AAA. He used to be a top prospect. He came up, he had a couple of good years, and then his bat just fell apart with St. Louis. I mean, he had a 67 WRC plus in 265 major league plate appearances with the Rays and the Cardinals last year. Now, he's much better from the right side of the plate as a switch hitter, but he's got options. He's under team control for 2 more years. He's just great depth to have. The O's are certainly going to work with him in AAA Norfolk, try to get that bat back that he had when he was really good and he first came up his first 2 years with the Cardinals. But that is nice depth to have, whether it's an injury to Tyler O'Neill, whether it's Ramon Laureano just stinks again, and you DFA him, you can call up Carlson, like whatever it may be, you have that depth there. Then you also have Daz Cameron, just in case. Brought him back in a small trade this offseason. He was with the Orioles in Norfolk in 2023. He wasn't a great hitter in 66 games with the Athletics last year, but he did post an .817 OPS and a 134 WRC plus against left-handed pitching. Again, another right-handed hitter who hits lefties well. He's a non-roster invitee right now. He'll begin the year in Norfolk, another good depth option who the Orioles know well, who can play all 3 outfield positions. And then there are some NRIs in camp. I don't see these guys coming up too much, but Nick Gordon, Levon Soto, Taron Vavra, Jordan Adams, Franklin Barreto, all non-roster invitees in camp who could play the outfield at the big league level and have done it in the past if the Orioles need them to. But that's the bench. That's the depth. There's certainly some outfield prospects in the mix as well. Maybe not for 2025, but definitely down the road. We'll talk about those big names in the Orioles system to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Supply House. Get the supplies you need from the site made for the skilled trades, Supply House. Whether you're plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from 400-plus top brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast. And if you need help with an order, Supply House offers expert support and leading industry service, so you always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free TradeMaster program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage, and now it's your turn. So join the TradeMaster program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, you can use the promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's at supplyhouse.com. So we finish things off with our 2025 Orioles outfield preview by looking at the prospects. And first, we start with the two guys who are going to begin the year in AAA Norfolk, both of whom who are in big league camp with the Orioles at the moment. The first is Dylan Beavers, left-handed hitter, Orioles number 5 prospect via Fangraphs last year, can play all 3 outfield positions, was the 33rd overall pick out of Cal in the 2022 MLB draft by the O's, / 241, 343, 413 for a 118 WRC plus in AA Bowie last year. Got the bump up to AAA Norfolk just for the final week of the year, played 6 games for the Tides before the season ended. So he will begin the year in AAA Norfolk as an everyday outfielder, with a chance to help the Orioles this year if they absolutely needed him. If he was on fire at Norfolk, they needed an outfielder, it is possible. I'd put a timeline as more of 2026 for Dylan Beavers to get to the big leagues, but he's also a very tradable prospect at this point in that he's at AAA. He's knocking on the door to the big leagues, especially if he's playing well in Norfolk to begin the year. But there's outfielders who are better coming up behind him, and there's also a solid group of outfielders in the big leagues right now. And there's still some upside there with Beavers. Wouldn't be surprised if he's in a trade package at some point this season, but is an important prospect to watch either way. Judd Fabian in a similar boat, Orioles number 7 prospect at Fangraphs, right-handed hitter, plays all 3 positions in the outfield, but is a great defensive center fielder with a really strong arm. He can go get it. 67th overall pick out of Florida in the 2022 draft. He had a 117 WRC plus in 98 games in Bowie last year. Then he got promoted, and then it was rough in Norfolk. 30 games for the Tides, 125 plate appearances. He hit 159 with a 26 WRC plus and a 41% strikeout rate in AAA. Remember, I mentioned Colton Cowser having a 31% strikeout rate and it being the 3rd highest in baseball last year. Judd Fabian, again, small sample size, 30 games, had a 41% strikeout rate against AAA pitching. That is a problem. He plays great defense. He's got big power, but he absolutely needs to bring the strikeouts down if he wants to get to the big leagues. Again, I would target him as more of a guy to debut in 2026 if he's still with the Orioles. If he doesn't get the Ks down, I mean, the best he could be is like a 5th outfielder Ryan McKenna type in the big leagues who could pop a home run every once in a while. If the strikeout rate stays where it is, he may never even get to the big leagues with a 40% K rate. But if he could even get it to 25 to 30%, like the power and the defense are playable to give him a bigger role in the big leagues. Also a possible trade candidate in that same boat as Dylan Beavers, but an interesting prospect to watch this year. And then a little bit lower in the at least minor league levels right now, we start with Enrique Bradfield Jr., Orioles number 4 prospect, left-handed hitter who was their first-round pick, 17th overall out of Vanderbilt in 2023. Hit 287 with a 133 WRC plus in 27 games in AA last year after he was good in Aberdeen, got promoted to Bowie, and hit really well down the stretch. He'll most likely begin the year back in what is now AA Chesapeake with the Bay Sox, but it's elite speed, elite defense in center field, really good batting eye, really good bat-to-ball skills. The reason why he's not like the number 1 prospect in baseball, it's no power. He doesn't hit the ball hard. It's really interesting to see, like, will he become Ben Revere? Little throwback name. Or can he become Stephen Kwan? Those are 2 different things and 2 different possibilities for a guy like Bradfield. I don't think he's a big leaguer this year. He'll be a big leaguer in either 2026 or 2027. And I think he's a guy the Orioles want to hold on to, a very high floor prospect who could still break out with a high ceiling. But what kind of player is he? That is a really big question. I'm so intrigued to watch Bradfield this year. And then the last guy, just to mention again, he won't be in play this year, but Vance Honeycutt, Orioles first round pick out of UNC last year, 22nd overall, number 11 prospect over at Fangraphs, but they're kind of low man on Honeycutt. Most people have him in their top 5 in the Orioles system. Played just 18 minor league games after the draft between Delmarva and Aberdeen at the single A level. Hit just 176 with a Judd Fabian-esque 43% strikeout rate at the low levels. Now, this is the issue we knew with Vance Honeycutt. Incredible defense, great arm, incredible speed, huge power. He's got all the tools except for the hit tool. Crazy amounts of swing and miss, crazy high strikeout rates in college. Some of the highest strikeout rates of a player ever drafted in the first round. It's going to be tough for the Orioles to get that swing and miss down to a point where he can be an impact big leaguer. Now, I think he's going to get to the big leagues no matter what, because the defense and the power are so elite. Even at this point, he's going to make it there. The question is, even more so than Judd Fabian, because Honeycutt's just a better prospect than Fabian is, with better tools all around. Can he cut it down enough to be at least a solid to average major league hitter with the bat to ball skills? That is going to be the toughest prospect for this Orioles hitting development group that has done such an amazing job on so many young hitters since Mike Elias and the crew took over back in November of 2018. Their biggest and most challenging prospect and project is going to be Vance Honeycutt. Let's see if they can get that done. He'll most likely be in Double-A Chesapeake for most of this year. Speaking of Vance Honeycutt, we'll be back on the show tomorrow. We're talking prospects. It looks like, not confirmed, but it looks like, most likely, our friends from Orioles on the Verge, Bob, Nick, and Zach, are going to be on the show to do our annual Orioles prospect draft, drafting our favorite prospects in the system. We're going to make a little bit smaller teams this year than we usually do, but you hear about a lot of young Orioles prospects who are making their way to the bigs. That is a can't-miss episode coming up right here tomorrow. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.